Hi, it's Danielle from the blog warmwithtime.com, where I help you design a home full of vintage charm. And in today's video, I'll be sharing how I transformed this broken, forgotten, damaged vintage buffet into something that's actually beautiful, practical, and will totally add a lot of charm and character to someone's home. So if you're interested, just keep on watching. So I picked up this vintage buffet off Facebook Marketplace and I paid about $50, which is a total steal for a vintage buffet. So it really needed a lot of work. Mostly it had a ton of peeling veneer off the top, the drawer front, and the sides were completely missing veneer. Also, it was missing some appliques and one of the leg supports was loose. So the first step in this process was to go ahead and remove all of the peeling veneer. So the veneer was in such bad shape that it couldn't just be re-glued and fixed. It needed to be completely removed from the piece. So to do that, I'm just using a hammer and a pry bar and hitting the pry bar underneath of the peeling veneer with my hammer. And I'm being really gentle and keeping the pry bar flat so that I'm not gouging the wood below. So the guy that I picked up this buffet from actually said that it survived a house fire and has basically been sitting in an abandoned barn for several years. So over time it was exposed to a lot of extreme heat and even some water damage, and that's what's allowed that glue to reactivate on the buffet and cause it to start to peel away. I had a lot of fun peeling away the veneer on this buffet. It was very satisfying to see it pull off in these huge sheets. And it's probably just as satisfying to actually watch these huge sheets come off from this buffet. So the appliques on the door fronts actually were embedded in the veneer, and so I'll show you on later on the video how I actually saved them. So once I removed off most of the veneer, there was still a couple of areas where the veneer was still well glued and needed to be removed. To do that, I just took some wet rags and let them sit on the piece for about 30 minutes. So after letting the rag sit for 30 minutes, then I just went in with a putty knife just because it's thinner and I'm able to get underneath the piece a little bit better, and a hammer, and just remove that veneer as before. So once all the veneer was removed, then I just needed to sand everything and get it nice and smooth. So I'm using an orbital sander and a 60 grit sandpaper to just go over all the areas where the veneer was removed, especially the areas where it was really stubborn. And as I'm sanding, I'm just taking my hand and just feeling where the rough spots are and where I need to go back and resand. The next step was to go ahead and give the piece a good cleaning. And we had lots of dead bugs and cobwebs that needed to be removed since this piece was pretty much neglected for a really long time. And when I clean, I don't use any fancy soaps. I just use Dawn dish soap and some regular water to go over and clean up any grease or grime and cobwebs that I find. The next step that I did was to go ahead and stain the piece. Now this is completely optional, but I knew that I was using milk paint on this vintage buffet, and milk paint has a tendency to sometimes chip. And any areas where we exposed the raw wood by removing the veneer, I didn't really want those areas to show raw wood if the milk paint did decide to chip on those areas. So that's why I went ahead and used a cheap Lowe's stain that I picked up. This color is American by Minwax, to match as closely as I could to the stained areas that were already on the buffet, but to make sure that if the milk paint did chip, that it would not show raw wood, it would show more of a stained wood beneath. So on this buffet, the appliques that were on the cabinet doors was actually embedded in the veneer. And I wanted to actually save these appliques rather than get whole new ones or just go without, because they add the character and the charm. And the veneer had two layers, a top layer that was a much thinner and then a thicker bottom layer. So what I wanted to do was remove the applique from the thinnest layer on the top and separate it from that thicker bottom layer. And I'm using an X-Acto knife to gently trace around the applique all the way around and making sure to press down firmly. And then once I've went over the whole piece and traced out the full applique, then I just went ahead and gently removed the top layer, the thin section, away from the applique, so that we're just exposing that thin layer around it. And then once I have that outer layer removed, Then I'm just gently going to take my X-Acto knife and push it up underneath the veneered applique and try to gently remove it from the thicker bottom layer so that I can attach it back to the piece. And once I had the appliques removed, then I just needed to smooth out the edges of them because they were a little bit jaggedy from being cut out. So I'm using a high 300 grit sandpaper here to just sand out those edges. And the next thing I needed to do was make an applique for the other door that was missing this detailed trim, and this is the piece that I actually pulled off the buffet. And what I'm going to do is, rather than just remove it so it matches the other side, I wanted to actually make a mold of it and recreate that exact trim on the other door. So to do this, I'm using this silicone easy putty that I'll put a link in the description below. This stuff works really well. You basically just take equal parts of both color putties and mush them around until the color is consistent throughout. You're looking for like a medium purple color because it was a dark purple mixed with white. And then I'm just going to go ahead and quickly mold whatever it is I'm trying to make a mold of, in this case this applique. And I'm making sure to push down in all the details so that when I pull off the silicone, it's made a really good impression of all the details of this particular trim piece. This putty work sets up really quickly, so you only have about 5 minutes to actually mold whatever it is you're working with, so work quickly. And then once I've molded what it is I'm working on, in this case the trim, then after about 30 minutes I can pull away the trim that I made an impression of, and you can see all the details are exactly the same from our trim piece that we already had. And then once I have my mold made, now I'm actually going to make the actual trim that's going to go onto the buffet. So I'm using an air dry clay that I just picked up off Amazon, and I'm pressing that into the mold that we created with the silicone putty. And I'm making sure to keep the air dry clay as smooth on the edges as possible because we want it to lay up flat against the buffet. And I just store mine in a Ziploc bag to keep it for next project. You only need a little bit at a time. And while I'm making the molds, my husband was actually helping me find the center of the cabinet doors so that we could put the appliques that we cut out from the veneer dead center of these doors. So he's just measuring for center to make sure we get them straight. And then once we had them put on straight and he found the center, then I'm just taking some wood glue and putting them on the appliques and sticking them on the piece. And then I just used some random bricks that we had laying around the yard to push down on the appliques so that the wood glue would dry flat. And then my handy husband also helped me reattach this decorative piece that went between the support legs of the buffet. And he's just using wood glue, putting that in the holes where the support piece was. And then he's going to use a pipe clamp to actually clamp it together and hold it good and tight while that wood glue dries. And the last and final detail that I need to add to this buffet before we can actually get to the fun stuff, painting, is to reattach the air dry clay trim piece that we actually made from the other piece that we weren't missing on the other door. So I'm just taking the air dry clay and I let this sit for about 2 days so it could get good and hard. It'll be hard like a rock, and that's how you know it's fully dry. And then I'm going to take E6000 to glue it onto the buffet. And then I'm using some kitchen clips that I have we use on chips and stuff to just hold it in place while that E6000 dries. So once everything was reattached, appliques are fixed, veneer is pulled off, and everything's cleaned up, it's finally time to get to start painting. And I'm mixing up some Miss Mustard Seeds milk paint, and this is in the color Linen. And when I mix milk paint, I mix my milk paint with a 1-to-1 ratio of milk paint powder to water. Remember that authentic milk paint is going to come in a powder form, so that means you need to mix it up right before you're about to use it. And if you've never used milk paint before, be sure to check out my how to use a milk paint video, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. So when you're mixing up your paint, you don't need to use any fancy equipment. I'm just using a metal fork that I designate for mixing up milk paint. But since this buffet was rather large, I needed a lot of paint. I just went in with my immersion blender that I bought from Goodwill for a couple bucks to mix up the paint and really make sure that powder is mixed well. And once my paint was mixed, I made sure to wait about 10 to 15 minutes before I went ahead and started painting. It's important to wait that duration of time about 10 to 15 minutes after you mix your paint, because it really makes sure that all the pigments in the paint have fully dissolved in the water before you get started with painting. And then I'm just using a synthetic bristle brush. This is a zebra brush. This is the fan brush to brush on my first coat of milk paint. This zebra brush is one of my favorites because it lays the paint on very, very smooth. So I could have just used my sprayer and sprayed a coat of paint on, but there's something very therapeutic about brushing on a coat of paint on a piece. I really had a lot of fun on this guy, even though it did take me about 30 to 45 minutes to put on one coat of paint. If you're a beginner to milk paint and painting furniture in general, that you know that generally the first coat of paint is not going to look so cute. So when I'm brushing it on right now, you can see that it looks fairly decent, but once the paint has really settled in and soaked into the pores of the wood, it's going to look a lot more patchy and streaky. And that's totally normal for a first coat of milk paint. In fact, this is what the buffet looked like after just one coat of milk paint. You can see there's a lot of patchy areas looking very streaky. This is totally normal. So I'm just going ahead and brushing on a second coat now. And you can see here with the second coat, we're really building a lot of coverage. The streaky look before is really dissipating, and it will only continue to dissipate as we put on more and more coats of paint. And once I was done the second coat, then I could kind of notice on the sides of the buffet, it was looking like it was starting to bleed through a little bit. And with bleed through, what that is basically tannins from the wood are getting pulled up through the paint. And no matter how many coats of white paint I put on this buffet, that yellow undertone from the wood is going to continue to penetrate that layer. So what you need to actually do is use an oil-based product to block those tannins from pulling through the paint. And my favorite product for that is shellac. So the shellac will basically block that bleed through so that we can apply another coat of milk paint over top and not have that yellow tinge coming through the paint. And once I have my bleed through blocked, then I'm going ahead and brushing on a third coat of milk paint. It's important that when you're working with multiple layers of milk paint that you're waiting about 1 to 2 hours for that previous layer of paint to fully dry before you add a subsequent coat. The reason being is that if you try to apply the paint too early, you can end up brushing up the paint that you just applied, which really defeats the purpose. And if the paint's not well adhered, it's just moving around as you brush. And here is what she was looking like after 3 full coats of milk paint have been applied. The color is absolutely beautiful. It is like a warm white color, not too yellow, but also not a stark white either. Absolutely beautiful. Okay, so the next step after painting is just to buff out the paint. So I like to take my orbital sander and I just use the 220 sandpaper to go over all of the areas and basically sand the entire buffet just so I can get a really soft, buttery feeling. So the purpose here is really not to try to distress the piece. I'm just simply trying to sand and smooth out the paint so it's super, super buttery soft. And as I'm sanding here, I'm taking my hand and running it across the buffet so I can really feel exactly where the paint still feels a little bit rough. And any areas like around the details of the trim, I couldn't get in there with my orbital sander, so I'm just using the sanding block and sanding by hand. And around the details of the legs, I started to notice that that's where we were getting most of our chipping. So you can see here in this clip that the paint was starting to chip away, and this is really the advantage that milk paint has. It has this ability to chip in these areas and look really organic, like the paint has weared away over time rather than it forced with a distressing technique. And the last and final step is to go ahead and seal your paint. So milk paint is a porous paint, meaning that it needs to be sealed before it can be wipeable and protected from oils and dirt. You can use many different types of sealers, but one of my favorite methods of sealing milk paint is with a polyacrylic. So this is similar to a polyurethane, only it's water-based, and I buy mine in the matte finish because I like my milk painted pieces to also keep that matte finish that the paint naturally has. And I just brush it on by hand, and when you brush it on you can kind of see like a bluish tinge to the paint, but that'll go away once the sealer has actually dried. And when I'm hand brushing, I'm making sure to use a synthetic bristle brush. I would not recommend using a natural bristle brush with applying your sealer. And so I'm basically just brushing it on in one direction and going in very long strokes to really get that smooth finish. And since I'll be selling this particular piece, I wanted to go ahead and stage it up so that I could get a good photo for Facebook Marketplace. I really find that when I take the time to stage the piece, as it creates more clicks, more people are looking at the photo, and in turn, I'm selling pieces a lot faster that way. So here is the final buffet. I'm really thrilled about how lovely this buffet came out. I really think that this linen color looks beautiful with the soft patina brass of the hardware, and I love that the legs got a little bit chippy but not too much. It's absolutely beautiful, and I think it would make a wonderful entertainment system or a buffet in someone's home. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. I had a lot of fun transforming this vintage buffet, and I think that she's gonna look amazing in someone's home, especially for the holiday season. I really hope that today's tutorial inspires you to try making over a vintage piece of your own. I really love adding vintage pieces to my home because they add a lot of character and charm and uniqueness to my home that really sets it apart from anyone else's. So if you're interested in seeing more vintage makeovers, be sure to subscribe to my channel to see weekly projects. And until next time, I'll see you later.